Good morning, everybody.
Okay. I'd like to welcome everyone to the JCCV Safeguarding Children in the Jewish Community During a COVID-19 World. The Jewish Community Council of Victoria understands that the vulnerable in our community are particularly under stress in our community owing to the social, emotional and financial impact of the pandemic. The JCCV has a strong commitment to child safety across our community. At this time, I would like to remember the positive impact of the late Anton Herman, the JCCV Vice President, in pursuing child protection best practice as we reflect on his first yahrzeit this week. We are all living in a COVID-19 world, and the demands have never been greater on child protection and supporting those most vulnerable in Jewish communities across Australia and America. We know there has been a drop in reports of child abuse during the pandemic, but recognise this is not reflecting the reality and are likely to receive an influx of reports of abuse in the months ahead. Today, we are most fortunate to welcome child protection specialists from Australia and America to give us an insight into the current issues facing our Jewish communities regarding child abuse and protection during an ever-evolving pandemic. It is now my pleasure to welcome and introduce our speakers and moderator. Shira Berkovits from the USA. Hello, Shira. Shira is President and CEO of Sacred Spaces, a behavioural and psychologist and attorney specialising in criminal law and the synergy of psychology and law as related to sexual offending and faith groups, bringing a uniquely Jewish perspective to her professional focus. Shira partners with Jewish leaders to reduce the risk of harassment, abuse and other forms of interpersonal harm. Shira sits on the board of the Academy on Violence and Abuse and is a member of the National Coalition to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation in the US. Shira was selected as the Wexner Field Fellow and named the Jewish Week's 2017 36 Under 36 for her pioneering work on abuse prevention. So we very much welcome Shira to today.
Yeah.
Next, I welcome Victor Vape, also from the US. Victor is Director of Education and Research for the Zero Abuse Project. He is President of the Academy on Violence and Abuse and founder of the Gunderson National Child Protection Training Centre. Victor has trained thousands of child protection professionals across America on child abuse investigation, prosecution and prevention, and been instrumental in undergraduate and graduate programs on child maltreatment and best practice. Victor is the recipient of many prestigious awards, including the Heritage Service Award for the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence. We are very privileged to welcome Victor to our presentation today. I now have pleasure to introduce Michelle Meyer from Melbourne. The JCCV has worked closely with Michelle to guide the Victorian Jewish community in our responses to advocating for child safety during this pandemic. Michelle has had an extensive career working with survivors of child sexual abuse and their families in sexual assault centres. She is a restorative engagement facilitator for the Commonwealth Ombudsman and for the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services Redress Scheme. She has worked extensively in the Children's Court of Victoria in a mediation role and in the Federal Circuit Court as a family report writer. Michelle is a child consultant with Victoria Legal Aid and with a particular interest in child-focused family mediation. Over the last 5 years, Michelle has been the CEO of SEDEC, engaged in advocacy, support and delivering education forums to support survivors of sexual abuse in the Jewish community. Michelle is a founding member of the Child Safety Communities of Practice in the Jewish community, and I warmly welcome Michelle to our presentation.
Thank you.
Our moderator today is Rachi Averbukh. Rachi is passionate about child safety, an experienced policy professional who values a collaborative approach, working with organisations to develop lasting attitudinal change. Her experience includes National Child Abuse Helpline Coordinator for Childwise, lecturer in the School of Social Work at Monash University in Melbourne, and manager of the Child Protection Policy Service at SEDEC. She has recently been the Safeguarding Children and Young People Manager for a large national sporting body. Rachi is also a founding member of the Child Safety Communities of Practice in the Jewish community. And I now hand over to Rachi to moderate this very interesting session.
Thank you, Judy. Good morning, everybody. And or should I say good evening to our wonderful guests from the US. I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to cover some small admin tasks to begin with. We request for everybody to keep their mute button on throughout the event, other than our speakers, of course. And if you do have a question, please post it to our group chat, which is a function available on the Zoom screen. And we will endeavour to get there depending on how much time we have at the end of our presentation today. I'm going to run today quite freely, to be honest. I'd really like to welcome our guests to have the opportunity to engage in a collaborative conversation around many topics, including current online risks, children being secluded with abusers during the current COVID-19 pandemic, and the current stress levels that parents are under. Also, it'd be good to be able to compare the Australian versus US experience of the pandemic. So please feel free, speakers, to interrupt if you'd like to interject and give your information, your experiences. But I will call on you as I get the opportunity to throughout the morning. So thank you all once again for giving up your morning or your evening to speak with us. This is a unique opportunity for us to be able to reflect upon what is unprecedented times throughout the world, really, and to share the impacts it's having on safeguarding children and young people and also vulnerable adults at this time. So to begin with, I thought it would be good to start perhaps with you, Victor. Just wondering what your general experiences of right now are guiding your practice in the current COVID-19 space.
In my work in the United States, I work a lot with criminal justice professionals, so investigators, prosecutors, other court officials. And there are four things that are particularly problematic for us right now. We rely in the United States on mandated reports to protect children, and teachers are the #1 reporters in the United States. And so children, once schools closed down and teachers weren't having regular interaction with them, there was a noticeable decline nationally in mandated reports. So that was a concern. Simultaneously, we had a surge in cyber tip line reports. So there's an indicator that sexual predators or potential predators are taking advantage of the situation, children at home and isolated, dialoguing with nefarious folks online, and that has been noticeable. And then many law enforcement agencies have pulled back resources. And so we haven't been as proactive in investigation, which is a problem as well. And then we're seeing in hospitals across the country an increase in emergency room visits from children suffering egregious abuse, which is an indicator that things are awry at home and tipping over into a very dangerous cycle. So those are things we're seeing that are concerning, that we're trying to push back on. And I just want to say at the outset, if at any point today you keep seeing me looking down, it's just because my daughter Naomi has been in labor all day. And so I keep checking my phone in case there's news that my grandson has been born. So if you hear a big woohoo at any point, that just means there's really good news in my family.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you, Victor. Shira, perhaps you'd like to share your experiences at the current time.
Sure. So you asked Rachi, what's guiding our approach at this moment in time? And so I'd say that there are a few things we're really thinking about. One is we're asking ourselves and we're asking the youth serving organizations that we work with, what policies did you used to have in place? Because the principles are the same. And so instead of thinking that everything is new in an online environment or during COVID, the exact same principles that you had in real life, you need to now think about in these online environments. And you just need to say, how does it apply? But don't forget the underlying safeguarding rules. We're realizing, as Victor said, that people are facing extreme stress in terms of finances. Many organizations in the Jewish community are closing down, are furloughing employees. And so we're trying to the best of our ability to change our fee-for-service model to pro bono consults and services where possible so that we can continue the work and the organizations can continue the work. We're asking, how do we standardize and make the material as accessible as possible? And so later in this call, I will share a link to some of the resources that we're making available to every youth serving organization. And finally, in terms of our approach, this is really difficult, and we recognize that we don't have all the answers. And so we're turning to the people on the ground, the youth serving professionals, and we're asking them to partner with us. And I'll share some examples of the way in which the people in the community are providing real insight and in many cases are real heroes. We really need to look out for a number of different risks. And I believe, Rachi, that will be your second question. So I'll address that then, but that's the overall approach that we're taking right now.
Thanks for that, Shira. I think you make a really valid point, particularly around the use of technology and need to revise our policies and our safeguarding policies specifically to be able to handle that. I wonder if I can ask you a follow-up question in regards to how do organisations who potentially haven't really developed that side of their safeguarding policy manage in this space? Because the reality is that technology is all-encompassing, and if you haven't got the expertise to understand it, you're really up the creek without a paddle.
Yeah, look, I'd say that that's true, that most organizations don't, right? This was a very big pivot. And so if you're a youth serving organization that has always been working in person, suddenly you're faced with this tremendous lift of getting all of your programming online in a minute. And if you haven't had a great website, well, now you need to have one. And if you don't have a full-time tech person, well, then people are working really late at night, even as their own children are home, and they have to deal with that as well. And so it is hard. And I would say, just as organizations are valuing the technology, if they're not stopping and thinking about the risks that the technology introduces and they don't find time to address that too, they're not doing their job. It's that simple. And so I'll give you an example. A lot of the schools have been recording Zoom sessions, and they're doing that for good reasons. So maybe they want to allow students to catch up on the recording later if they missed a class, or they want it available to principals to do spot checks. But there are problems with recording if it's not thought through. Who's doing the recording? Are the students aware that recording is happening? Where is the recording being stored? How is it being used after the fact? Are teachers saving that recording on their handheld devices and having access to those recordings indefinitely? Those themselves are child safety issues. And so what we've shared with organizations is this is how you go about recording safely, respectfully, and making sure that everyone involved has fully given their consent. And if you can't follow these guidelines, that's okay, but you can't record right now. And so it's okay to understand that organizations can't do everything at this moment in time, and they have to also be willing to make a decision to say, well, then therefore we can't do this because we can't do it safely.
Thanks, Shira. Michelle, would you like to share your thoughts at the time?
We've tried to be supporting organisations with rethinking, as Shira said, some of the reviewing of their policies. We've maintained relationships with schools in particular, and with ongoing resources, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, we had to do a 360 and think, what are the implications of this for schools in particular? Schools were shut down, children were at home, there were all the risks with children going online. I don't think we've always been cautious about children being online. Now we're encouraging them to go online, and we've sort of thrown parents into the deep end with supporting that arrangement, but we prepared parents for what is required to ensure that that's done safely. And that goes across the board, from little ones from as young as 2 and 3 who are accessing the internet like never before. 77% of children between 2 and 5 are accessing the internet. And of that 77%, I think about 75% will click on to any pop-ups that come up. So I think we just need to think about some of the context of what was before, and now thinking about it even more so now, and what are some of the risks. So particularly within the school population, children at home, online, often in their bedrooms alone. So there are the online risks. There are also the risks of children being more isolated at home, having free access probably to the internet more than ever before, and what that means for children, particularly those that might have already been at risk, and now the risk factors are more pronounced, isolation and access to internet, and possibly no monitoring of parents. We know that children who are engaged in harmful sexual behaviours, those are some of the risks that we are certainly aware of. So how do we support parents to understand those risks? I've been in contact with organisations in the last week because when Shira and I thought about this topic initially, we thought, yeah, we'll be talking about post-COVID and all, and we'll be well on our way out of it by now. And I was just letting Shira and Victor know that Victoria is is going through its second wave, and we are experiencing far more restrictions again, and so we are still in the thick of this, and we have to just be supporting organisations. So yeah, touching base with organisations with some of the identified risks. Again, as Shira had said, let's work in partnership, find out what the needs are at the grassroots levels. Some synagogues, for example, aren't functioning and doing some great work using this hiatus to develop their policies. Other services are online and doing some work that maybe they hadn't done before, and are identifying areas that we might need to all work together on to be addressing those risks. So I think I'll probably have some more thoughts as we continue, but certainly there's some of the things that we've been doing at SEDEC as CASA during this time.
Thanks, Michelle. I actually wonder, you made a point about the fact that we're going through a second wave here in Victoria at the moment. I wonder whether you've actually seen organisations better, I suppose, supported to be able to respond to potential abuse, particularly using technology. I know that we're not currently back at homeschooling, but there is the potential that could happen again. I wonder whether you've seen any organisations or schools that are better developed now to respond to the need for young people locked down.
I think it's an ongoing challenge, Rachi. I think we thought we had this covered, but as we are developing and evolving, and we thought, yes, we're coming out of the pandemic, and we were becoming a bit more relaxed, and possibly thinking that our previous policies were covering the situation, where we're now thinking this is going to be a more long-term arrangement. So I think we have certainly got to be thinking about this very differently. Have organisations got this covered? I think they're thinking about it, Rachi, particularly here in Australia, where policies were part of our legislation, where the schools are trying to work hard to just get on top of this. And I think we still have a way to go in understanding some of the nuanced risks that are prevalent during this time. So yeah, I think we've still got a way to go, and I just have to put a call out to our e-safety commissioner. I think it's an excellent resource for people here in Australia. Internationally, it's a fantastic resource that we certainly use and support the community using as well for understanding the online risks for both parents and for the people who are involved in organisations.
Absolutely. I think along that note, we've also got, I believe, a study being undertaken at the moment from the Commissioner for Children and Young People, who is trying to capture or attempting to capture children and young people's voices during this time. So it'll be interesting to find out what that develops and further develops our understanding, but also the services that will be provided based on the findings from that study. So I'll be very interested to see what that is down the track. If we might take a slight detour at this point, and I might come back to you, Victor, to begin with. We mentioned before around the risks associated with online predators particularly, and I'm just wondering about what we've learned about the risks associated with persons of concern during this time, and potentially have we identified who they are?
Well, the primary risk is children are at home, they're not engaged in activities, whether it's school or sports or with their shul or their children in their neighborhood. So they've got a lot of time on their hands. Mom and dad may be stressed out and are sending them away, and so they're just online more. Plus, the risk of physical abuse and neglect is going up, and that often sends children online looking for an outlet. So the conditions are right for sexual predators to take advantage of this, and there are indications that they are actually doing that, taking advantage of it. In terms of who sexual predators are, the vast majority are men, and they're often looking for children of a certain age, so adolescents, teenage children, and they're usually looking for children who've already got a hole in their heart. I mean, they'd be interested in violating anyone, but they're looking at children who are having a tough time. So if a child's online saying, you know, Dad hit Mom last night, nobody really understands me, I wish I could get the heck out of here, those are the children who are easiest target for those that are online looking to access children.
Thank you, Victor. And in terms of your experience of the types of risks, we know that obviously predators, when it comes to child sexual abuse in particular, tend to be quite known to the family, be it a family member or a close contact, potentially a neighbour or relative. Are you seeing any changes in the current climate, given the fact that obviously children have been in lockdown with particular family members? And obviously we know that we may not see an increase in our statistics at this point, and we're expecting a delayed response. In your experience, have you identified any of this?
Well, you're right that most abuse is in the family unit. So 100% of neglect cases, the perpetrator is mom or dad. If we're talking about physical abuse, 90% of the time the perpetrator is mom or dad's significant other. If we talk about emotional abuse, 90% of the time it's mom or dad's significant other. Even when we get to sexual abuse, national data tells us 60% of the time the perpetrator is mom or dad's significant other. Even if you go outside of those figures, still sexual abuse is often in the family unit. It's the uncle, it's the grandparent, it's an older brother or sister. But if we're talking about online sexual activity, then it's more typically somebody the child doesn't know, somebody the child is intersected with in one or more online forums, and they may be pretending to be somebody very different than who they are. And so you've got a lot of predators out there just trolling, and they're going to whatever sites children are hanging out in Australia, and they're looking for kids that again are needy kids or looking to get away or looking for some sort of outlet, and then they take advantage of them. So it is a little different. But let me make one other point. abuse in the home often leads to abuse outside of the home. There's a concept called polyvictimization, which tells us that a child abused in one way is often abused in multiple ways. Specifically, according to a study of 11,000 maltreated children, about 2/3 of those children were abused in at least two categories. So if you see something like physical abuse, you have to think there's a 2/3 chance there's at least another form of abuse going on. And about 1/3 of all abused children fit into 5 or more categories of maltreatment. A second very important part of polyvictimization that leads into your question, Rachi, is once you're abused in the home, especially if you're abused in multiple categories, you're more likely to display behaviors that are often indicative of trauma. And online predators are really good at identifying those behaviors that are indicative of trauma in the home, and then they take advantage of that, and then they violate the child all over again. So the abuse that begins in the home often leads to abuse outside of the home. Here in the United States, 90% of trafficked children are runaways from homes where they were enduring multiple forms of abuse, and then somebody outside that home took advantage of that and said, I can get you away, I can get you a better life. And of course, it was just the opposite. They were preying on the child all over again.
Thank you, Victor. And I think you make a really interesting point about children that have been trafficked. I know that in the media recently, particularly in Australia, we have identified a number of trafficking rings, particularly in Asian countries during COVID, where parents who, for potentially needs for money or simply opportunistic, have been utilising their children via webcams and the like. And there's been a lot more online traffic from predators, particularly from Australia. So I wonder whether this is going to be something we're going to see the ripple effect for many years to come. Michelle, let's allow you to have a moment to reflect upon this at this time. I'm wondering whether you have seen firsthand, particularly given the fact that you're currently working in a space where you do have access to survivors and victims of sexual abuse in particular, whether you've seen any changes to the types of contact, are people reaching out more often in relation to online potential risks or simply lockdown with perpetrators? I know there's been an increase in domestic violence in particular, but I'm wondering from your experience what you've seen.
What we're seeing is less people engaging in support services. The contact through counselling services has certainly been significantly less during this time. And so one worries about, particularly for children, what is actually happening at home. Conversely, I'm currently sitting in a service that supports children with harmful sexual behaviours. That service is functioning at probably 90 to 100%. So if they're not seeing children on a weekly basis in person, they are having online contact with those children. Family violence, certainly the initial statistics were down, but now we're certainly seeing that people are reaching out for support, and we have to think that children are certainly going to be exposed to family violence, and the ripple effects for them is going to be significant. I also just wanted to refer back to some of what we're seeing and knowing about children and the risks of being online. Victor certainly made a very important point about children being susceptible to contact from sexual perpetrators, and we know that those children who are at risk are more likely to be the identified victims, but we also are seeing more contact between children, child-on-child contact, and that certainly was something raised by one of the schools recently, is that we've introduced children to this new platform. We can monitor them during school time, but we're also aware that they're having contact out of school hours. And so never before, and I think within, say, a Jewish Orthodox context, I think the concern is boys and girls having contact with one another outside of school time. Halavai, if that's the only thing that we have to deal with right now, that would be you know, that's very important within the ultra-Orthodox community, and you know, that certainly has to be respected and considered. But we also have to think about child-on-child having contact. We have to think about cyberbullying and the impact that that's having. And there's been an exponential increase in those dynamics. Children who are isolated are more prone to engage in risk-taking behaviours like sharing nudes online. Again, seeing concerned about the potential increase of them placing themselves at risk, needing to have that social contact and doing it in a way that maybe before was seen as a way of courting. I know that that's certainly been an understanding of why kids engage in sexting and sharing of nude imagery of themselves online. But again, these are considerations that we all need to be having right now about some of those added risks for children as we speak. There's certainly concerns that we've had, and so we've been alerting schools to those risks. And I think, Shira, your point before about recording of a Zoom call, something that we may not have given as much thought to before, has so many implications for who has access to that kind of imagery, and how is it saved, and how's it shared, and very, very critical things to think about. But we also have to think about children recording themselves and sharing that too. So there are risks between adult and child, but also between child and child.
I think you're right, Michelle. And I think also, given the fact that we've just come out of 2-3 months of homeschooling, where most children would have been working for 8 hours per day on their computer, most likely in their bedrooms. So also that breach of I suppose, the private mode, where parents, teachers and other support people have access to a very private space, and likewise young people, and the ability to inflict pain and harm on others. So I might take it to a different perspective for you, Shira, if you don't mind. I'd really like to touch on, before you're mentioning how your organisation is doing their best to work with other organisations who potentially have dropped down to a skeleton staff and may not have the capacity to financially afford your services, let alone the capacity to actually complete the work. And I wondered whether you might like to talk more about the policies in particular that you think organisations should be looking at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I also want to, in answering that question, I'll say more broadly policies, practices, and education. And I'd like to tie it into what Michelle just talked about with children and the recordings. And so I'd say, I think that in many ways we have an opportunity here right now during the pandemic. And one of the opportunities we have is to teach about consent and to teach about boundaries, to teach about children's agency and teenagers. And I think that this is a really powerful moment if we utilize it properly. So to go back to the recording, yes, there are all the dangers of who has access and what happens to it, but even at the most basic level, children are sitting in a Zoom class, if you will. This is their new school. And somebody enters the Zoom room from the administration, perhaps, to take a video or a picture of everybody there to use in promotional materials to show, look how well we've pivoted. We're doing all this amazing programming. There's nothing wrong with good marketing. And there's something really sweet about all those videos we're seeing right now. And we're all incredibly impressed with what the organizations have managed to do. And yet, the child who is supposed to be there to learn and focused on their own learning is suddenly being recorded. Somebody is taking a photograph of that child. They're maybe conscious about how they look. They're not free to just relax and learn, which is the whole point of what the children are doing. So at the most basic level of what emotional safety looks like, it's that they should be able to be present in the moment, and nobody should be taking their image without their consent. That's so fundamental, and yet it's something that's happening across the board. We're just, all of us are entering a party, a bat mitzvah, a something, and we're going, oh, this is so cute, I want to send it to the family afterwards. Snap, and we do a screenshot, right? but what happens to that screenshot and who gave consent to it? It's the same thing with boundaries, Rachi, that you were just talking about things happening in bedrooms, right? So this is a real opportunity to teach not just the youth, but the staff as well. Yes, we all have different situations. I'm zooming you right now from an apartment with very limited space. So it's not always feasible to say, go sit in an office or a living room where there's nobody else around. I get that. And yet, if you can't and you're in a bedroom, can you scoot down to the floor and have a blank wall behind you so that you're not sitting on the bed? Can you put a virtual background on, even if it looks a little hokey, right? Teaching people, all people, don't show up in your pajamas, show up in some professional clothing. These are things that can be codified as policies and are also things that should be trained, because as soon as you have adults Zooming with children who are lounging around in bed, and sometimes the adults are doing the same, there's an intimacy there that wasn't there before. So this is a real opportunity to model what it looks like to have safe behavior. So in terms of the policies, I would say it's the very same policies we'd have in person, and that's 2D leadership. So if 2D leadership is the gold standard, what does 2D leadership look like online? Well, that means that you have multiple adults in a Zoom classroom or camp program. And if you can't have 2 adults because you don't have the capacity or the staff for that, how is your Zoom class observable and interruptible? And so that might mean that the Zoom link is on a shared school calendar that everybody can access in the school. It might mean that bar mitzvah lesson is happening at the table in the kitchen, and there's a parent in the background who's cooking. It's actually more convenient now than ever to be able to have 2 adults in. You can have a principal or a camp director or some other administrator have a Zoom window open while they're doing other work. And so it is possible to have 2 adults. We want to think about communication channels. So are you emailing from your personal email, or are you emailing from a school email? Are you using social media to contact youth? Do you have policies around that? We talked about already professionalizing the participation. We need to talk about Zoom security. So one of the things we're seeing with a lot of organizations is Zoom bombing, where people will enter the Zoom and in a number of cases have shared sexually exploitative images of children on the Zoom call with other children on it. That itself is abusive, and it's a form of exposure that children should never have, and it's happening to numerous organizations. So it's very simple to counteract that, but the same way you'd be thinking about physical security, how are you thinking about your Zoom security? And I guess finally, the last policy I talk about is really screening measures. So we're seeing people relaxing their screening measures. This is a mistake. For all of the reasons that Victor and Michelle talked about, there's increased risk now. Online predators have greater access, so we need to increase our safeguards, not decrease them. But instead, I'm seeing posts that look like this. Who wants to volunteer? Have you ever worked as a camp counselor before? Come on, work at our school. We're going to set up a homework buddy system. Or I'm seeing parents say, who wants to nanny my kids? And they're almost taking anybody who's available because everybody is so desperate. We've seen camps who are saying, as an attempt to counteract COVID, rather than having large bunks, we're going to make small groups where there's only one counselor with the children. But that would never happen in person because we know there should be 2D leadership. So the very things we're trying to do to counteract COVID are introducing new risks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shira. And I think you've actually touched on my next question, which is in relation to the types of risks that we've learned in the current circumstances in relation to organisational policies and responses to child safety and how we should respond to it during this crisis. And I wonder, Victor, whether you have some thoughts in particular to the specific risk that we know is increasing and how we should respond as individuals and perhaps as organisations.
The risks, we articulated before. Children are isolated, stresses are going up, predators have more access to children. So those are the risks. Now, how do we respond to it? A, we respond with policies that Shira has articulated, but B, Shira alluded, we need training. And so we need to train 3 groups of people: our staff, and we need to train parents, and we need to train children. So what do we train our staff? Well, we certainly educate them about the policies, but we also want to educate them about signs of potential maltreatment. So you're not intersecting in person with youth in your shul anymore, but you may be intersecting with them via Zoom as you have a class of one type or another. And so what might you see? Well, you might see what you're seeing of me, so kind of the upper torso. What would be signs of, say, physical abuse? Well, a hand slap, so 2 or 3 linear lines, a hand imprinted on the child's face, that would be suspicious of maltreatment. Perpetrators of physical abuse often grab the child's ear and pull him across the room. And so you get a little pock mark of blood in the ear and behind the ear. And so if a child turned their ear and you saw something like that, that could be suspicious. Perpetrators may pull a child's hair and a little pocket of hair actually comes out. That would be suspicious. Marks around the neck as you try to choke a child, that would be suspicious of maltreatment. You're just on the Zoom meeting and you hear yelling in the background. That may be an indicator there's quite a bit of stress in the family. So pay attention to signs such as that. And then we want to educate the parents and the youth about personal safety. So educate mom and dad to have some checks and barriers on your youth's activity, just as you might as they're going to a neighborhood event. You'd have some checks, who's going to be there, that sort of thing. Well, what are they doing online, and what parameters have you set for that? And creating an open conversation, so if they go online and something scary happens, that they can talk to mom or dad without being punished. And then educate youth. What do you do if you're in an uncomfortable situation? What are your options available to you? We can do that sort of education even during the pandemic. There are a number of organizations. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has a program called NetSmarts that is free, and there's online versions that you could put into your community. There's a program called Shield, which is based in West Virginia, but they designed a series of online trainings for both parents and youth about these dangers. If you can't find those, I can help you access that. And then the last thing we can do to push back, at least on physical abuse, a lot of that is driven by stressors. So we can help families manage stress. The World Health Organization has great free online resources. So check the World Health Organization regularly, and there's great materials you can put in the hands of the families in your congregation. This will help you manage your stress and will help you manage the stress of your children. The American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children has a great section on their website of resources for communities to utilize and put into the hands of your family. Shira and I are on the Academy on Violence and Abuse, an international organization. We also have a section addressing COVID-19. So there's a lot of good information out there, and we just need to work together to get it into the hands of our families.
Thank you for that, Victor. I think that's wonderful resources. And I know that Shira's also made reference on the chat, if anyone's interested, to a resource that's available for online safeguarding for youth-serving organisations. So please feel free to click onto that. Before you mentioned that, particularly from a child protection perspective, we know that educators and schools are a safety net when it comes to securing children and ensuring their safety. And you mentioned just then quite a few different ways that potentially someone on a Zoom chat, for example, could actually see a physical mark on a child or young person. I'm wondering whether this leads somewhat to my next question. I will head to you, Michelle, for this one. I'm wondering whether those indicators are the next step in education that we should be providing to schools and teachers, particularly if they are engaging in homeschooling. And I'm also wondering about the implications of those findings that you just mentioned, Victor, from an organisational child protection policy. Perhaps, Michelle, you might like to attend to that.
I think that, again, we need to be thinking about our policy work. It's great to have policies, but what does that look like at an implementation level? So again, I was talking before about synagogues using this time to be redeveloping their policies if they're not seeing children face to face at the moment. This could be a time where they recognise that children aren't coming to synagogue, but they're still part of our community. What can we be doing to be supporting parents right now with the information? Just as Victor has described, there are phenomenal resources. And yes, Zoom isn't the best way, or whichever platform isn't the best way to be accessing parents, but we can be doing that creatively via online forums, written resources, getting out there and informing parents. Also, of course, reminding teachers. Teachers do have annual information about mandatory reporting, and they would cover some of the indicators that Victor has alluded to. But again, with all the chaos of being online with students and teaching students, I think you just need these constant reminders. It's not something that we ever we can never get enough of, just to be more aware. When, you know, I've been hearing people feel exhausted at the end of a Zoom session, teachers telling me how much more exhausting it is teaching children online, and even more so to be monitoring the dynamics within the classroom is going to be, it is far more exhausting. But it's important that we keep the awareness about all the indicators. They may seem basic, but we just need to be reminded and reminded and reminded. Rachi, I just wanted to also talk about what some of the organisations are doing, and I think it's camp season for Americans, and even for us who are going into winter holiday time. So I think that is also an area of I don't know what you're doing in America, Shira, with what's happening with camps, but here in Australia, they've been having online camps. And so again, we're in the online platform, and what do youth leaders need to be aware of in having contact with children during this time? Youth leaders who may have been having some contact, but this is going to be certainly much more intense time of contact with children, and also preparing parents in a different way. You can't just drop off your kids at camp anymore and just say goodbye. You need to be aware and monitoring, and here are some of the dynamics to be aware of. There are, you know, lots of things happening within the community, and creating awareness at the levels that Victor alluded to. A whole community approach. It's not just educating one, and ultimately the adults are the ones that are responsible for the protection of children.
Thanks for that, Michelle. I know we only have about 10 minutes to go, so I'm really keen to maybe move a little bit further away from the discussion around policy and actually talk about what are some of the really tangible steps that we can take, perhaps as both individuals and within organisations, because I know we have quite a diverse collection of people